Dirty Scrap Podcast.
So first of all, thank you so much for making the space to be here with us. Welcome to Dirty Scrap, the aluminum podcast. This is the first time I'm having four guests at the same time. The most amount of guests I had in the past was two, but I think this episode will be very interesting for the audience for several reasons. First of all of you guys are leaders in this industry. Second, I think you represent what we really want to make into this industry, that is vertical integration. I can see that here we have everything related to scrap sourcing, sorting, segregation, trading, and also cast house experience, transforming that scrap into some value added products. So welcome again. Thank you so much for being here. And the first thing I want to do is this is going to be very organic. I have a couple of questions, but I want us to build up the conversation about the industry, how the industry was in the past, how everything is changing right now, how this transition is impacting the industry. And then at the end, we will talk about the coalition and how this coalition will impact the industry as well, and how policymakers needs to, turn their heads into this industry and allow us to make a little bit more. So let's start with you, Matt. I know you guys been in the industry for a long time. How you started in this industry? Because all the experience that I had or that I have right now in this industry, everyone jumped into the industry by accident. No one was like, for example, Bob, I think you are a biologist, right? So it's a little bit weird to me to seeing you in this position in trading with metal. So Matt, how you started in this industry?
So I started in this industry back in 2000 with Anheuser-Busch. So Anheuser-Busch at the time had a vertically integrated packaging group that had Bev can, Bev lid, UBC recycling. We printed labels in Tennessee, and we melted glass bottles in Texas. So we were a pretty diversified, vertically integrated packager. But obviously the core of what we did was around BevCan. And actually Bob and I, that's where Bob and I were connected back in those days. So that's how I got started in the aluminum space, and learned a lot. And actually my last role before I left Anheuser-Busch was in can sheet procurement. And at the time, AB had a coalition of at least two counterparties that they were buying can sheet on behalf of, working with all of the rolling mills in the US, and then providing that can sheet to the can makers in the U.S.
Okay, interesting. How have you seen a lot of different changes through the years since you started to now? Because something that was surprising to me, and I think I already talked to you about this. I'm from Colombia, so coming from a third world make me think about, okay, U.S. is the future, right? And when I started 10 years ago in this industry, I was waiting to see the future of the technology here, and sadly, I am seeing technology from 30 years ago, and we are like keeping in the same path. Now we are seeing more and more like willing to change that direction. But had anything changed since the day you started to today?
Yeah, I think we've seen significant, transformation from a technology perspective. And I think, if you talk to the rest of the coalition members here on the call as well, everything that we look at and investments that we're making is really around innovation. And that innovation is not necessarily just looking to take cost out of what we do, but it's really innovative on the types of materials that we can collect and process as well. It has changed dramatically in the 20 plus years that I've been around aluminum, and it's pretty exciting to see that continued evolution. And it's really one of the things that this coalition is really advocating for is continued R&D in this type of technology, but then take that R&D and get it commercialized. That then allows us to do more of the processing, to your point, of the full supply chain, from collect and trade to sort and clean, as well as melt and cast.
Right. What about you, Bob? When you started, how you became like a biologist and then you are trading metal?
Well, I don't know how I got into it, but I came from a similar background as Matt. I worked for Ball for a long time. I ran plants for Ball in the food division, and then kind of went a different way for a while, and then circled back to Anheuser-Busch packaging group with Matt, and then kind of veered off in another direction for a while. And then in 2015, I joined Shapiro. so didn't know much about the scrap industry at all, but have been here for almost 12 years now.
Interesting. Mark, what about you? How you started in the industry?
Well, I think I'm a little older maybe than these individuals based on their entry point into the market. But, I started late in 89. I had to get a job in order to support my schooling. And I started with this aluminum company, and I thought, I'll do this for 6 months and then I'll progress into something else. And here I am talking to you today. So, it's been a great industry, started with a great company, vertically integrated, casting, extrusion, fabrication, advanced assembly. The first portion of my career was from a technical side, heavily technically based, and then the second half of that has been heavily on the management side. Then had an opportunity to transform into a global company, tier one automotive, same thing, vertically integrated, and then a great opportunity with MX Holdings where we added on, the component of our trading side of the business, our casting, extrusion, fabrication, assembly. And what I've been able to experience through that period of time is the value of vertical integration, also the value of secondary casting operations. There's lots of attributes associated with that, and I'm sure we'll talk about those during the discussion. But I've also seen the advancements that have came and the value that's brought to different markets and very specific applications, and the performance that comes out of it, whether it be, cost, sustainability, supply chain resilience, the technical side of it. Because of my background, I've got to see it from both perspectives, the technical side and then also the management side.
Okay, cool. Interesting. And let's go with you, Tim. How did you start?
Yeah, my story is a little similar, maybe similar and different. I started in the beer business, selling beer right out of college.
I like beer.
And that was 1985 to 1987, and that parlayed into a career at Alcoa Recycling, which Matt and I did not cross paths at Alcoa, but we used to refer to Alcoa Recycling as the evil stepchild at Alcoa. But it was really it was the beginning of the UBC recycling wave. And I think if folks remember back in those days, Alcoa, Reynolds, and other aluminum companies were striving for a 60% recycling rate on UBC. And ultimately, they achieved it. They did a lot of promotion to get there. And I don't know if you remember the old, you wouldn't remember the Alcoa Can't Wait ads back that they used to run during NFL football games, but that was a great way to get the message out on how valuable aluminum can recycling is. So I was at Alcoa for 5 years, and then Mark Chupan basically came to me and offered maybe an offer I couldn't refuse as a small family-owned business back in the day. So most of my career, I've been over 40 years now in the UBC space. I became chief operating officer at Chupan about 8 years, well, I guess like 12, 13 years ago. We started a trading group 8, 9 years ago, and we really kind of exploded in the UBC space. But we also handle other non-ferrous scraps, of course. That's how the business got started, and been very successful. Mark and his company, we've grown tremendously since I've been here, and it's been kind of exciting to watch. And we've become a key supply member to the industry, to the aluminum industry.
Right. And you said something important that I think is one of the, I will say, the goals that we have in the industry, that is increasing the recycling rates, because right now the recycling rates we have in the US, mostly talking about UBC, they are very low compared to Europe, even though some Latin American countries like Brazil, right? We are around like 42%, and I will say the entire Europe is around 75%, but if you go to Germany, they are close to 90%. Spain is 75, something like that. Brazil is almost 100%. Why? I have two different questions, and I want you guys to jump into, the conversation. I don't want just to focus on one folks, but the reason that I'm talking about this is because I want to understand, if you talk to someone 30 years ago about the aluminum industry, they will talk about the primary sector, right? But right now, what we are seeing is more and more importance into the secondary sector. When that change started to happen, and what are those different conditions that we are having right now comparing to 30 years ago, that we want to go into the direction that we can actually increase the recycling rates, because to me it looks like the secondary sector is becoming more like an strategic industry for the US instead of just having like, a part of the industry. So what do you think about it? How was the industry 30 years ago? What is changing? What we are seeing right now? And how we can just go into the path that we really can reach those recycling rates that we want to hit?
Yeah, I guess I'll jump in here a little bit because I've seen that transformation. If you go back 15 years ago, primary aluminum was in a lot of applications an expectation or a requirement,
Right.
pretty hard requirement actually. And over the past 10, 15 years, that's changed considerably. There's always a place for primary metal in certain applications, and in certain applications, there's obviously value associated with it. But in today's markets, and those are advanced markets, that could be military, that could be automotive, could be building and construction applications, secondary is a requirement in many cases. And it's just because of the lower energy cost per unit. It's 95% less. Therefore, energy volatility has less of a impact on that, so it's a little bit more stable. Secondary is more efficient relative to location of demand. You see secondary facilities usually attached to an extruder or adjacent to, so logistically it's very efficient. And then we get into the sustainability side. There's been a lot of change relative to that. Even over the last 2 years, we're starting to see mandates, expectations, specifications for various products. And again, not just in the automotive market, but the automotive market is kind of driving a lot of this. And the way that you achieve those CO2 levels and get into those world-class 2K, 4K metrics is through secondary. Both secondary utilizing recycled content out of extrusion operations and that full circular process stream, but also deeper into the recycling content. And I think that's where the technology has changed, the ability to have a better understanding of the type of scrap that's coming in, the better segregation. All of that has driven secondary demand higher and higher. It has also allowed that secondary product to go into more and more applications. So for me, I continue to see that grow.
Yeah, Julio, if I reflect on kind of, where we're at today, when I started at Anheuser-Busch back in 2020, I think at the time there were still 23 aluminum primary smelters in the United States. And those are the days when Midwest Premium was still 3 to 4 cents. It was really an afterthought at the time. Fast forward to today, we all know there's only 4 remaining smelters because the world took on this initiative called globalization. And we just decided to start sourcing aluminum from all over the world, from the lowest cost country or lowest cost jurisdiction. And then again, the unfortunate part was we started to see all of these primary smelters close. And it's kind of how we've gotten to where we are today. Again, we applaud what we're trying to do on the primary side because, we all know the gap is pretty sizable on how much unwrought aluminum we're bringing into the U.S. But the primaries can't do that alone because the other thing that we're all competing for is energy. And so, I think that's the most critical point. Back in 2020, energy was still relatively inexpensive in the U.S. and it's gotten exponentially more expensive. You fast forward 26 years later. So that's the landscape has changed dramatically. And as Mark said, the ability is secondary to come in and help fill that gap and use 95% less energy than the primaries and get shovel-ready projects moving quickly with, groundbreaking to ribbon cutting as quick as 18 to 24 months. That's where we really think we're trying to really push, some of the narrative in Washington to really focus on secondary as a real strong alternative and a complement to what primary is. Right. And as Mark said, I think it's a very interesting point. That is the secondary industry is more stable. And we are seeing this right now. And this is my perspective, but I want to understand and to hear your perspective because the primary sector looks to me that what we really need right now to keep the primary sector alive is policies that we are seeing right now during this administration, right? Like tariff and increasing the price of the primary that is coming into the U.S. in order to be more competitive. But if we don't have those approaches, definitely the primary sector will not be reliable or profitable in the future. But the secondary sector definitely depends on
just on the market, right? Market price, and is demand and supply. So what do you think is going to be this strategical point of view to increase our recycling rates, and why we are not seeing, because I am seeing that everything is going into that direction, but I am not seeing huge investment into the US. I mean, I saw like probably last year a lot of different cast houses being announced to be new greenfields this year and the next year, but nothing is happening very quickly. Why is that? When we are seeing that the secondary aluminum industry is more stable and looks to me that is going to be the future of the industry. What do you think about it? Why this is happening?
Well, I think
I
in
can address.
secondary,
No, go ahead, Mark. No, go ahead.
I think a lot of what you spoke to is relative to the market volatility, right? And no market likes volatility, and there needs to be an understanding of what that long range looks like. And when you think of a secondary, that's a shorter term than a smelter. A smelter is a very long range outlook. You're talking
Definitely.
30, 40 years. You need to have stability. You need to understand what regulatory policies and practices are going to be in place for that. In a secondary operation, it's a little shorter term, but nevertheless, the instability of a market comes into play. But it's also the advantage of a secondary. You have shorter supply chains, less volatility, less lot sizes, the ability to flex capacity easier than maybe what a smelter may have. And I think what you're seeing, at least from the extrusion secondary industry, from my perspective, is just getting grounded on where are the markets, how does this instability that we're seeing currently in material supply into the U.S., what effect is that going to have on demand in the short term? And I think that's what's driving a lot of decisions
Right.
in the U.S.
Right. And globalization, how globalization is impacting this market right now, and what are the strategies that we have on the table right now to, keep going? Because at the end of the day, it's something that is happening, is hitting us, and not just us, the entire world, but how this globalization is impacting this industry, and what are those strategies that we have on the table to keep moving forward?
Yeah, and it's a supply and demand question, right? Is what does that volatility have relative to supply in the U.S.? It is also, we're all aware of where the price points are on metal, and what is the sustainability of our product at those price points. And I think that can cause some demand issues in the market, and therefore secondary production or additional capacity is reflective of those price points right now. My experience in the industry is this always cycles. We always see this 3 to 5 year cycle occur. But this is a little different. This is a little bit different in the sense that it's being driven from beyond the borders of the U.S. It's a global impact relative to the supply chain.
Right. Why you said that is different right now, and in which part of this cycle of 3-5 years are we right now? And I also want you, Bob, and Tim, to talk about it. I want to have a really good conversation because you already have a lot of experience as well.
Well, I think that it's interesting because you're talking about recycling rates and we're talking about the market, and I think Mark alluded to how those are interconnected. But on the prompt scrap in the space we operate in, I think that's also under pressure. You have AI enabling technology to help manufacturers get more yield. You have people dipping down into the market and offering closed loop programs, so it's kind of stays in their supply chain. It doesn't make it out to the market. You have non-traditional competitors affecting you that have relationships with people that are emerging as big users of aluminum. So I think you're competing for the demand for prompt scrap is higher, but you're competing for lesser units because they're tied up potentially even in consolidation. And then when you look at that and you evaluate that dynamic, then what are we dealing with? We're dealing with upgrading material that used to be downgraded into cast.
Right.
So I think the recycling rates are for the prompt scrap are probably as healthy as they've ever been with regards to what the output is. You're seeing people cast closer in spec or in tolerance parts. You see all of those kind of dynamics in play. And I think when Mark said, I think it's different this time, I think that also is contributing what's different.
Okay.
I think part of your question is like why are the recycling rates so low and what are we doing about it?
Yes.
I think we have to start with like what's not being recycled. And as Bob just mentioned, most of the non-ferrous aluminum scrap is being recycled, but what's being exported, like Zorba and Twitch, we know that that's leaving the country, and that's where I go, well, economics matter. Why is that being processed domestically?
Right.
And Matt might be able to speak to this a heck of a lot better than I can, but why is that leaving the country? Part of that answer, I think, is that from a secondary standpoint, we're at a little bit of a disadvantage economically to produce it here or to manufacture it here. So we need to come up with incentives, a way to keep that domestic. And I'm not advocating for the ban of exports, but I think with the right investments and the right relationships with business and government, we can, as an industry, address that need. The other thing is UBC. So Zorba and UBC, those are the two things that are not really being captured by and large. And a 43% recycling rate on UBC is abysmal. We did hit 60%, and that's just steadily declined, and that's a collection issue. So why are we putting 2 billion pounds of UBC in the landfill every year in this country? Those are critical minerals that really should be captured, and they could easily be consumed. So how do we go after that? And there are some efforts, but it's a long putt. We know that deposits work, but we also know that's a really, really difficult political thing to try to get around and make happen.
Right. And Matt, how we can go to what just Tim said, trying to improve the collection of this kind of material. And let's talk about Zorba separately from the UBC. Why Zorba is going out of the country? Because I understand what Tim said, that maybe from the technological point of view or whatever it is. But I think right now we have a lot of different options from the technological point of view that will allow us to handle and treat the Zorba in a really good way in order to take out the aluminum that is in it and try to do something else with the byproducts, right? What is happening with those materials and how we can solve that issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all kind of know why we're seeing, that material leave, right? It's really a labor rate arbitrage versus, the U.S. versus, folks in Asia and other parts of the world where they have a significant advantage on labor because it's still today a relatively manual process. I think that's where, as Tom was mentioning, if we can really get investments in the infrastructure here in the U.S. To really close that arbitrage on labor and automate it to where those units can stay here, that's really critical. And I think that's, one of the things that, as this coalition is building, we're talking to companies that are making those investments, which we think are extremely important that we make. And I think, one other thing to really piggyback on what Mark was saying, as we cycle through these, 3 to 5 year events, Mark used the word volatility. I kind of use the word uncertainty. And when you think about the secondary market, we all have, I think, ideas of where we would like to invest to, continue to grow secondary. Right. But because of the uncertainty in the market relative to tariffs, and, we went from 10 to 25 to 50. Now there's a proclamation that has reduced that again for certain suppliers that are going to make, greenfield or brownfield investments on the primary side. So there's just a lot of uncertainty that the secondary folks like us are dealing with. Mm-hmm. Here's the thing. We are all great companies, right? And we're all, for the most part, family-owned, ESOP-owned, mid-market companies who have really strong balance sheets. I'm not going to say we have big balance sheets, but we've got really strong balance sheets and we want to make the investments. But what we need is a level of certainty that the primaries have been given in the U.S. They have been given certainty with certain programs coming out of D.C. All we are simply asking for is provide some level of certainty to the secondary market. And I think you will start to see people line up to make some investments to grow it here in the U.S.
Right. What kind of alignment do you believe is going to be necessary to have this certainty and not the uncertainty? Because at the end of the day, yes, we can talk about this, but what are the the proposals that we want to put into the table in order to have this certainty and to make the investments?
So, I mean, some of the things that our coalition are looking at is, just high level, like some of the programs that have been used in the past. And I think you can go out and do an AI search on what's been funded from different, departments within Washington. Those are applicable, right? And I think as we start to talk about energy, right, and the reliance in the U.S. on energy, we really, as a coalition, push hard in our discussions and our narrative around, again, how efficient we are relative to energy. Even within what we do today, there are investments that all of us can make that continue to reduce our current energy consumption just with emerging technology. So that's one. That's not even necessarily a greenfield investment, but even existing operational investments that we can make to reduce our energy consumption. I think the other thing is, you hear a lot in the news around critical materials. Again, the advantage of secondary is as we remelt these, secondary alloys, the critical materials are already there. So theoretically, we're not having to add those to what we're melting. And there's even other, different alloys that we work with within our business that we have a line of sight to where we can really put in some new investments that can really help avoid having to use more critical materials and then save those critical materials for other uses, right? And you hear a lot of it out of the Department of War. Obviously, with the Middle Eastern conflict, there's a lot of discussion around the importance of aluminum supply chains, I would say both primary and secondary. And, that's the type of support that I think this coalition and really this coalition is not about the 10 members that are in it. This coalition is here to represent all the secondary market. Selfishly at Metal Exchange and Penex, our motto is we before me. And one of our leadership principles is others before self. And that's how we really operate as a coalition, that we're here, with the voice of the 10 of us, but it's really to cascade for everyone that's involved in the secondary market.
Right. Go ahead, Bob.
I also think that it's investments and support for investments around the upgrading, the sorting, those type of things are also kind of an imperative to keep the critical minerals that are shipping out with the 2.2 million metric tons that's being shipped out. The other thing I discovered is that, we're still landfilling about 1.8 million pounds or metric tons of aluminum just by virtue of it happening in the U.S. And that's a big number as well.
It is. And I think one of the issues we have in order to hit those recycling rates is that we have a lot of flexibility here in the U.S., talking about, the landfills and the environmental regulations, because if you go and see Europe, definitely you don't have it. I think the price to landfill 1 ton of any kind of aluminum you need to pay, I think, is around 220 euros per ton. It's a lot of money when you talk about a lot of volume, right? And definitely they want to protect more the environment. I think it's really good. But do you think we're going to see a huge change in the industry if we keep this flexibility here in the US? Because at the end of the day, we need something more like that complicate the things for us in order not to use the landfills and start looking into the other direction. But do you think that we really will hit those recycling rates while we are keeping this flexibility in the country? No? Yes?
Can you repeat that question? Because my phone's freaking buzzing over here.
No worries. Yeah, no. What I'm thinking is, okay, we want to go in that direction, right? We want to increase recycling rates, but we have the flexibility of the landfills. It is possible to reach those rates and still having that flexibility, or we need to avoid that flexibility for good and start improving our recycling rates, our technology, and understanding better sorting, segregation, and everything downstream. What do you think about it?
Are you talking about like mining landfill already landfill UBC and other aluminum scrap?
Yes, get rid of it. Do you think it is something that we need in order to reach those goals, or not necessarily?
My personal opinion is mining out of landfills is almost a non-starter because the quality is so bad that it's going to, and it's it's going to be very, very difficult to do. I know there's some technology out there that's trying to capture that. So I'd like to just boldly answer your question. Taking stuff out of landfills and trying to get it in the recycle stream, I don't think is the answer. We got to get it before it gets there. That's my personal opinion on that.
Yes.
And I think there are ways to do that but they're not easy.
Julio, also, in addition to that, landfills are starting to fill up in the US. So some things might be happening in certain parts of the country.
Exactly.
And I also think you're seeing an emergence of EPR laws, and they're much harsher on things like laminated plastics and, different kinds of plastics. And it's a little bit more, less onerous on aluminum. Those things are certainly going to play a role in what you're in regards to your question. I don't know that I would be advocating for more regulation anywhere, but at the same time, there are natural things happening and there are things organically occurring, like the EPR laws in several of the states that are going to play a role in this down the road.
Right, right. And definitely to summarize what we've been talking so far is the industry definitely changing. Secondary aluminum producers are getting more and more involved into, getting more importance into this industry to be on the side of the primary sector. We are seeing more and more technology coming into the industry, and I think one of the most important technology that we are seeing right now, and Mark, I think you can help us here, is sortation. Sortation is becoming something more and more important right now. Do you think it is going to be certain kind of different technology that will allow us to increase or speed up this approach, or the way that we are doing things is just fine and we need just to keep working on it?
Well, I don't know if that question's posed to me, but I'll answer it from a perspective of how it impacts me. So with secondary billet, obviously the type of product that's being brought in drives the variability between my heats and my lots that I make a secondary cast.
Right.
That's one of the disadvantages relative to primary. So how do we close that down, and how do we get closure on that gap? And that's with the technology that goes into the sorting, so that I can have tighter control on my trace elements. I have a better understanding of what's going into my melters, and that comes from the technology further downstream or upstream, however you want to look at that. That's where the investment needs to occur. That's what closes the gaps relative to secondary and primary from that variability perspective, from the quality of the product. I think that's one of the, not the only, but one of the last remaining opportunities between secondary and primary that we can close through technology and through investment relative to how we process scrap.
Right. How important is vertical integration right now?
From my perspective in my business, it's critical, right? Because you need to have an understanding all the way through the entire process stream of the product, how that product's flowing through, where it originated, the traceability relative to it, the carbon levels associated with it. And I think that being well understood also drives economics of the product at the end of the day. So, I think the vertical integration is significant.
For MX Holding, Matt, what do you think and how do you see the vertical integration in this country? Is happening? Is really something that is hitting hard the industry in order to provide better, approaches? How do you see this wave right now?
Yeah, I think, as Mark said, vertical integration for the customers that he serves at Pennex is extremely important. And again, he talked about traceability and really understanding, the elements that are going into our customers' products. I think the other thing that it's highlighted is just, this recent Middle Eastern conflict, how fragile a global supply chain can be.
Right.
And how disruptive this event has really, impacted a lot of, and I'll talk about the extrusion market, a lot of their supply chain. And so it's getting folks in the extrusion side to think differently, potentially on how they may want to vertically integrate and add a smaller cast house to their operation. It may change their thinking on how they source from a geographic diversification. I think you're going to start to see that happen quite a bit. But I think controlling your metal units, whether it's upstream and collect and sort and clean, or if it's even on our side on the extrusion business to even have our own vertically integrated billet cast house. A lot of people are asking that question right now.
Right. Let's talk about the coalition. Let's make things more interesting right now. How did you start it, guys? And why? Why? I already understand why, but I think I want to get a little bit deeper into when you started, who came with the idea, why these different companies and not another companies? Because to me, it seems like you guys can be competitors, right? If you see it from the outside perspective. But now seeing the coalition, and also we have, I think, tower extrusion and smelter services, and to me, it's like, wow, why and why now?
Let me jump in real quick because he won't say it, but Matt is the brainchild behind this coalition, and I want to make sure he gets his fair props on that because it was a heck of a vision. And then I'm going to let him talk after that about what SACA is all about. But coalition wouldn't be here today without Matt and Metal Exchange kind of stepping up and drawing attention to the fact that secondary is a player and is important to the supply chain and has a voice and it needs to be heard. And the other thing I'll say is like when we did our first trip to Washington, D.C., we were all kind of shocked, maybe that's too strong of a term, at how little was known about the secondary aluminum industry. So we spent a lot of our time educating the folks we met with on who the secondary is and why they exist, et cetera. So with that, I'll turn it over to Matt, and I apologize for speaking too much.
No, I appreciate it, Tom. So, really, Julio, how I got started, this actually is about 2 years ago. And I'll give Mark some credit. 2 years ago, the extrusion market was pretty soft and we were all feeling it. And it was just kind of inflation was high. Our demands were pretty sluggish. And so we were in a position at one of our plants in Northeast Ohio to where we had to really kind of scale back on our volumes, which obviously had an impact on our employees. And just full disclosure, we're a pretty competitive producer from a wage perspective in that market. So it wasn't as if we were at a disadvantage relative to that. It's just our volumes were really soft. And so Mark had to go up and do a town hall and explain to the organization that, we were going to have to cut back on overtime. And a lot of the folks within that plant were dependent upon overtime, just, from a, income coming into their households. And one of our employees approached Mark after the meeting and said that they understood why we had to, make some of these changes, but they were just simply struggling to financially afford school supplies for their kids. And when Mark told me that, two things went through my head. Number one is, and this is pre-Trump 2.0, this is when we were still Section 232 is at 10%.
Right.
And one thing went through my mind is like, how in the world can our employees who make aluminum products afford products that have aluminum in them? Beverage cans, shower enclosures, a Ford F-150, a new railing system on your outside deck when they can't afford number 2 pencils for their children. And that just hit me really hard. And so the whole premise around this is like, how do we keep aluminum affordable and the substrate of choice? Fast forward to today, 232 is now at 50%. At the time, aluminum's more than doubled in price. It's only gotten worse. And so the coalition is really, and as we've been in DC, is like, how do we help close the supply gap of the imports coming into the US alongside the primary guys? Because we've got to figure out a way to get that at parity with demand. Supply needs to equal demand, which theoretically, if you're an economist, says you don't really need the tariffs. Right. And then that's the way that you eventually, the tariffs are in place to do the right thing, onshore production. Secondary needs to be a part of that. But we need to get aluminum to be affordable. So it's a substrate of choice for, all consumers, whether you're a manufacturer or a consumer. And that's how this whole thing got started.
Wow. Why these companies? How you get involved? How you all guys get involved into this coalition? Why these companies and not other companies? Why?
I mean, we're all, like I said earlier, privately held, ESOP owned, for the most part, middle market companies. And we pride ourselves in that because I think what all of us do, and all of us, I think, as we operate our businesses, we care about not only our people and the communities that we operate in, but we care about the industry. And again, we will put others before self. Like we will, as a coalition, work with lawmakers and whomever else will listen to make sure they really understand, the importance of how secondary can come into the market. But at the end of the day, our initiatives to really help make aluminum to continue to grow in the U.S. Because if my concern and our concern is if things aren't systemically changing, then I think we're at significant risk here. And I think that's what we're really trying to push forward as a coalition. This coalition is long-term thinking. Every member inside of it thinks long-term. Right. We don't think short-term. We're not managing quarterly earnings per share. We're managing, 5-10 years out. That's how we think. And so I think the discussions that we're having with lawmakers as a coalition is in that vein. We're thinking 5 to 10 years out, and how can we really reestablish the United States as a strong aluminum producer in the globe.
Right. What kind of risk are you talking about?
From what perspective, Julio?
You just said that you feel like this coalition is to help different point of view of the industry and is a long term, but also you said that we are in a kind of risk. So I want to understand why and what kind of risk that we can see in the future for the industry.
Yeah, I think for me it gets back to the price, right? And when I think about the price of aluminum today, it's the highest in the world. And when you say that out loud, the United States has the highest aluminum price in the world. It's hard to fathom that that's the case. So when I think risk, I think demand destruction, I think substitution, and aluminum becoming a secondary material or to steel, to plastics, to composites. Yes, the consumer may not be feeling it, 2 to 4 cent increase in the beverage can that they're buying, but customers that we work with who make flatbed trailers, as an example, those are 3,000 pound trailers, and a doubling in their substrate cost for those trailers is a significant increase. And so if we're not careful, the market at these elevated prices will adjust. And our concern is if it lasts too long, some of these adjustments may become permanent. And that is, for me, the worst case scenario that could happen.
Right. But don't you think that having these huge prices right now will push the people to make more investments right now? Because it makes sense, right? Aluminum is expensive right now. And if it's going to be long term, makes sense to make the investments and keep the aluminum here and sell aluminum even here and outside. But even though we have this uncertainty, how we can fight that uncertainty with this coalition? Again,
I think that's why I said earlier, figuring out a way to work, with folks on providing some level of certainty. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we all know that scrap spreads are pretty favorable right now. And so the market's enjoying a pretty good time right now. But I'm going to say, I believe that's going to be short-lived. Again, uncertainty. And I would say that those are going to start to diminish here relatively quickly. And so that's where, from our perspective, if we want to continue to grow this industry, there has to be some level of certainty that we can, if these, like I said, our coalition members, great, strong balance sheets, but not the biggest, right? And I think we've seen other support provided to other segments of the aluminum market that provide that level of certainty. Again, that's what I think this coalition is pushing for all the secondary market, to provide a level of certainty that we want to continue to invest in the secondary side of the U.S.
Right. And from my conversations today and in other episodes, definitely uncertainty is like a common factor for the industry. But I want to understand how uncertainty is hitting all of you guys, because you have different perspectives from the industry, right? One of you is in the secondary cast house, the other one is trading and sorting, and team is more involved in UBC. So how this uncertainty is impacting the different sectors of the industry? Bob?
Well, for me...
Oh, Mark. Okay, go. No, go ahead. No worries.
No, just for me, it starts with my customer base, right? And what does that look like? And what does the uncertainty of those market segments? Because it translates down to them, as Matt mentioned, when you have metal prices where they're at today, it starts with my customers and then translates back into my process streams. So I think they need to have the level of confidence and predictability of where the markets are going to go. That's one thing that I would say is the one way to help our industry and industries in general is not to make sudden changes, right? Whether it's tariffs or whatever it may be, regulatory policy. It needs to be as predictive as it can be, and that understanding and that confidence that you're not going to have a significant change in policy or a significant change in tariff at any given time that could negatively impact suppliers, manufacturers, customers. So I think that's how I look at it from my perspective. And just to go back to the coalition, just very quickly, I think the coalition represents the broad spectrum of the supply base here in the U.S. So I think it's the right members. I would also add that, while we compete, and we've got a lot of great companies within our coalition, while we compete, you've got a coalition of advocates for the industry, and that's very important. Right. It's not necessarily the size and the number, it's who's in the coalition, right? And who they represent. And the purpose of being on the coalition. And I think that Our industry has a reputation of advocacy for it to protect it, and it doesn't take a coalition, much larger than the one that we have to have a positive impact. I always go back, and I've always used it in my career because I have always been a strong advocate of our industry, and I truly believe it. A rising tide raises all boats. And what we're talking about here is the tide. How do we raise that tide to raise all boats within our industry?
Right.
I would add, as a scrap supplier from an uncertainty standpoint, we're managing hundreds of millions of pounds of scrap a year.
Right.
And uncertainty will come from who we sell that to, and their uncertainty comes from world events that can change overnight. And you might have a deal with somebody that goes from very lucrative to a loser like that. So when we talk about uncertainty impacting the scrap supply side of things, we have to button down our relationships as much as we can with our consumers and the people we deal with every day. So the more uncertainty that there is in scrap pricing or the pricing of raw materials, even it just trickles down to the Shapiros or the Shupans of the world, and it affects our customers as well. Like who are we buying from?
I'll add I agree with Mark and Tom that's the main thing that causes the uncertainty, but I think the implications of that uncertainty is it limits our strategic agility. It affects how we approach risk. And I think that's where the innovation is stymied sometimes as a result of the things that Mark and Tom talked about.
Do you feel the same, Mark?
I do. I think innovation, investment, newer technology, there needs to be a return on that. And where does that come from?
Right.
I think just in my manufacturing processes, I can see opportunities from the start to the finish of the process stream where investments would provide additional value, provide a higher quality of product. It would serve more applications, including military and defense applications as well. But you need the certainty to be able to make those investments and make sure that there's a return on those investments once they're being made.
Right. Matt, what does success for SACA looks like? I know it's long-term. It's long-term, I know, but...
Long-term, and I was thinking about this question, and not that you had posed it, but I was thinking about it because I've been asked it before. I would say if 10 years from now, it's kind of like a self-defeating response here, is if, we don't need SACA, right? Because of all the things that we do, has really, proliferated into the market, and we've created this level of certainty for folks to make the investments, and the United States becomes a real powerhouse on the secondary side. Hopefully we don't need something like SACA 10 years from now. That's how I would view success, between 5 and 10 years from now.
Right. Are you thinking in getting more members, or do you think it is not going to be necessary?
We talk to a lot of people, and there's been a ton of interest, relative to what we're doing.
Right.
So we're not necessarily, we don't close the door on anyone who wants to have a conversation with us. I was, on a call this morning, and I said, we've got a lot of folks that we're kind of categorizing as friends of SACA, who I think are really going to help, with a lot of the narrative and discussion and advocacy that we want to push forward in Washington. So it's really gaining some positive momentum. And like I said, we're here to serve the secondary market. That's what we're all about. And we are not proud. We'll take any and all help that the folks in the secondary space want to provide to this coalition.
Nice. Let me ask you something, because I've been thinking about it and about SACA and this coalition and why this is different from the other associations that we already have in the sector. That they are also working something very similar to what you are working, right? What you guys are working to, but why SACA is different?
I think SACA is a little different because if you think about the folks you have on the call today, so the metal exchange,
that's the answer that I was looking for.
It's we obviously are involved in 3 different industry groups, right? We're in REMA, we're in the Aluminum Association, we're also in the Aluminum Extruder Council, and then our friends Tom and Bob sit in a couple of those same industry groups as well. What's interesting is we really wanted to think about, to Mark's earlier point, how do we bring a group together that spans what we call the 3 different pillars of the secondary supply chain? So collect and trade, sort and clean, and then remelt and cast. That's what makes us a bit unique. Because if you think about some of the other industry associations, they can get pretty focused in on certain initiatives, whereas SACA really provides a balance across all three of those different pillars that serve the secondary market.
Right. How do you see the aluminum industry, all of you guys, in 10 years, including the impact that you will provide with SACA? What is the future that we can expect on the aluminum industry, even though with all this uncertainty, Washington also with lack of policies? How do you see the future of the aluminum industry right now? If we are like right now, 10 years ahead, today, and if we look backward, what is the future? Not an easy question, I understand. I know, but that's the idea.
Go ahead, Bob.
Go ahead, Tom.
No, you go. You're much wiser than me.
Because scrap and secondary aluminum is becoming a strategic material, I think what we're going to see is us solving a lot of this challenges that we have right now with regard to exporting scrap. We're going to keep it in country because we've invested, we're upgrading that material, we're optimizing, and systematically the supply chain is working kind of smoothly, where everyone is kind of playing their role through it. Yes, vertical integration will be part of that. That's what I see. I think it's almost an imperative because of the critical minerals that we talked about, aluminum being so important to the infrastructure and the infrastructure competitiveness of the United States. Those are the kind of things that I see.
Yeah, I mean, there's 3 bullet points that come to mind for me, and Bob, you kind of hit on those. Is I think you see a more stable supply chain as a result of what we just weathered and what we're navigating right now. So I think the result of that is a more stable supply chain, which has value to everyone. I think that the value of the product that's produced will be better understood. And therefore utilized in different types of applications and different types of markets, both because of the understanding of it and the confidence in the supply chain that exists. And as a result of those 2 items, I think you continue to see growth in the markets over the next 10 years for sure.
Right. From the point of view of technology, what are you seeing from now on to 10 years ahead?
But you don't want to get me started on technology in the aluminum industry because
Let's do it.
all your podcast time. But I think it's all based on technology, and I think the more investment that's made in technology expands the opportunities for our material. It develops greater processes, and those processes combined with the controls of the material, like we talked today, the recycling and the separation and control of the trace elements. Continuing to enhance the technology all the way through the process frame drives better capabilities, higher degree of quality, and a higher value proposition, and expands you into more market segments. And from my perspective, what I know that you can do with different types of processes and different types of materials, it's only going to expand, again, that value proposition. And it will help or be required for us to ensure that aluminum remains the material of choice. And then in my business specifically, the extrusion process being the process of choice.
Right. Tom, do you feel the same?
I do. I was just sitting there thinking, like, what would I add to that? And not a lot. I guess maybe I would just say technology is going to continue to evolve, and we're going to have cleaner, more efficient scrap and aluminum products in the future. There's no doubt in my mind that's going to happen.
Let me ask you something before we wrap up the episode, because for me, it's interesting how the end consumer or the OEMs are seeing the aluminum cast houses comparing to the primary sector. They are talking about mechanical properties, right? And they feel that if you are not providing products coming from the primary sector, they will have not the same mechanical property. That I think it is not wrong, but it's also not accurate, because definitely if you have a good process and a good technology, you can have a really nice semi-finished product with high aluminum mechanical properties out of 100% scrap. What do you think is going to happen or needs to happen for them to have more trust into this process and getting more support, or giving more support to this industry? Not just talking about the CO2 emissions and going green, but also from the mechanical properties point of view. How are those steps that we can do in order to provide them more trust in our process?
Yeah, I think that's demonstrating the capabilities of secondary product into these more advanced applications. And I think for our industry and for secondary billet and recycling in general, it's important that we demonstrate the performance levels that can be achieved with secondary billet. And you kind of break that down. When I look at it, I break it down into two categories.
Mm-hmm.
One is the mechanical properties, as you just spoke about, right? And that's controlled relative to the trace elements and making sure that the chemistries are tight. And from my experience in my own casting operations and the scrap content I work with, that level of control is there. It can be improved, it can be enhanced as you get into more predictive type needs for chemistry specifically. Then you got the metallurgical side. You have the microstructure that's associated with the product. And the microstructure comes through grain refinement. And that grain refinement comes through what do you do with the chemistries? What do you do with the scrap that you're provided? And what type of process do you put that through to get a macrostructure at the casting side and a microstructure at the extrusion side?
Right.
And some of the more advanced suppliers in our industry understand that well, and they're producing at that level. I know at Penex we are, and the more of our industry that executes at that level will give a higher and higher degree of confidence to the end users that secondary billet can meet those mechanical properties. It can meet these product performance specifications. It can meet the metallurgical requirements. And not only can it do that, it is actually more nimble, more flexible, and can respond quicker. And I think that only continues to develop further and further. You know, what you can do from everything that you mentioned on all the different performance specifications that are required has only advanced year over year. Right. But it takes the entire value stream. And you asked me the question earlier, why do you think it's important to be vertically integrated?
Yep.
Because what you do in the cast house or what you do in the recycling side or the sorting side or the extrusion side, you have to take that entire process stream into consideration, because there's opportunities in each of those maybe to compensate for another area that may not be, as strong. So that would be my perspective on it. And it's something that I probably deal with on a weekly basis, is making sure that, those end users have the confidence and understanding of really what is achievable. And I think that needs to go beyond just the market segments that we, inherently has understood it, but get into other areas, whether it be aerospace or more into military. I think that's something that SACA has a tremendous opportunity to do. We all witnessed that on our first fly-in to DC, is that is not understood. That question that you just asked is the opportunity, because that'll only expand, the applications that can be used in those key areas where I think there's a tremendous focus.
Right. And one of the things that I'm seeing with SACA that I think is super interesting, and I really appreciate the opportunity to have you guys here, is I work with Hormesa, and I never want to use the podcast as a commercial platform, but one of the goals that we have is to help the North American aluminum industry to understand that recycling, sorting, and then casting and remelting and casting, they are not different industries. They are just one complete industry that we need to vertically integrate in order to go in the direction that you just said, Mark. So I think SACA is one of these initiatives that is going in that direction to help to make or to build this bridge between the scrap sources and sorting lines and then cast houses and products. So Mark, to wrap up this episode, what is that message that you want to give to the aluminum industry for what we have right now and for the future of this industry?
Are you referring to Matt or Mark?
To Matt. Sorry.
Matt. No, I think you hit the nail on the head, Julio. Again, this is why the makeup of the companies are what they are in SACA, because they, again, represent all three of those pillars that you mentioned. Mm-hmm. That's what's most important. And again, we all sometimes didn't sit in the same industry associations. Some of us didn't even know each other before we even did our fly-in DC in June. And the amount of collaboration that I've seen between the coalition members, and I think the continued education across what all these companies do, it's been eye-opening, for all the coalition members. And to your point, bridging that gap into this, I would say, I'll call it an enterprise-wide solution from collection to cast is spot on. And the more that we can work together as a coalition, the more that this coalition can work with the companies in all three of those different segments of our supply chain is extremely important. And, that's the strength that will come from this coalition and how we can work with the secondary market.
Definitely. Okay, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. For me, it was a really nice opportunity to have all of you here and to see what this coalition is looking for is just what I started the podcast because I want people like you guys to give input to the industry, to help the industry to grow in the right direction. So thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. Nice to meet you, Mark and Tom. This is the first time we are seeing each other because I already talked to Bob several times and to Matt. And hopefully, if I can help, I will be more than happy to do it. And if you can or want to use this platform as many times as you want, just let me know. I will be more than happy to spread the message. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Julio, appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, guys. Thank you so much. Take care. Thank you.
Dirty Scrap Podcast.